A daycare worker entrusted with the care of young children, now accused of murder. The victim in this story is a young boy who lost his life after his parents dropped him off at the daycare in May. We have the newly released details of what the employee allegedly did and did not do that the young boy's family says caused him to die in her care. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Stewart. No arrest or conviction could ever undo the pain that a family in Missouri has been dealing with over the past couple of months. But this family does believe they are at least a step closer to justice in the case of 3-year-old Conrad Ashcraft. I want you to take a look at a picture of Conrad. He lived in Park Hills, Missouri, which is about an hour south of St. Louis. Conrad, it appears from what we've been able to see on social media, received the love from his family that you would want for a boy at his age with his life all ahead of him. Conrad was on the autism spectrum. He was nonverbal. This is a tribute video that his mom posted on Instagram after his death. His family told a local TV station he had just learned to say, "I love you." Now, it's hard to hear the details of what happened on May 16th of this year when his parents dropped him off at his daycare. And I'll get into those details in just a moment and why prosecutors are now saying what happened to Conrad was murder. This is the daycare that he went to in Park Hills, Missouri. It was called Poppy's Playhouse, and according to a wrongful death lawsuit filed by Conrad's family, it provided services to children with special needs. Let's get into these details, and I'll warn you, they are really tough to listen to when it comes to what the employee inside Poppy's Playhouse is accused of doing in the care of Conrad Ashcraft. According to this wrongful death lawsuit, on May 16th of this year, when it was time for Conrad to take a nap, an employee allegedly put Conrad on his back and tucked his sides of his personal blanket around him, trapping his arms. Conrad allegedly struggled, so that employee turned Conrad onto his stomach, allegedly making it even more difficult for this boy to move. Allegedly, she then tightened the blanket even more. Then on top of that, the employee allegedly took a weighted blanket. This blanket weighed 18.2 pounds, and she put it on 3-year-old Conrad, even covering his face, allegedly. And then, if that wasn't enough, this lawsuit says Conrad was then put in the hallway, away from other children. That employee then put her legs over Conrad's to restrain him. All of this being done for a child in the care of a licensed daycare at nap time. You're taking a look at right here, count 2 of the indictment in the criminal case this employee is now facing. Now, after all of that, the employee allegedly didn't check on Conrad once he stopped struggling until it was time for her to finish work at 2 p.m. It is unclear how long Conrad was in this position. His family told KSDK-TV that Conrad, because of his condition, he was on the autism spectrum, he was not verbal, he did not have the ability to communicate if he was in pain. I want you to take a look at the mugshot of the employee who has, according to the family, finally been arrested in this case. Her name is Tiffany Hedrick, and among the charges she is now facing after Conrad died from suffocation, she is accused of second-degree murder. The wrongful death lawsuit that was filed by Conrad's family on May 27th, which was a little more than a week after Conrad passed away. But this arrest didn't come until last week. A grand jury indicted her on August 15th. Now Hedrick is being held without bond. People in Conrad's community have been rallying, though, since his death for an arrest in this case and for accountability and justice. Here's one of Conrad's family members posting on Facebook last week with a picture of Hedrick's mugshot, the caption reading, "Enjoy your stay, may you rot." Now, I will say at this point, Hedrick is presumed innocent. She has pleaded not guilty to these charges, and there will be a criminal case that will play out to determine whether she's guilty. But this arrest isn't the only fallout since Conrad's death. The wrongful death lawsuit also named the owner of Poppy's Playhouse as a defendant, and her name was Spring Gray. And here's a graphic that the city of Park Hills made for Gray because she was a member of the local city council. Here's a picture that she posted on Google of the ribbon cutting for her daycare back in 2022. And not only does the civil lawsuit accuse her of being aware of this technique that was allegedly used to restrain Conrad, this boy on the autism spectrum who was nonverbal, it also accuses her of not training her employees, like Hedrick, on how to properly handle children, like Conrad. Now, Gray, again, she was a member of the city council in Park Hills, but take a look at this post on Facebook that is still up announcing her resignation in the wake of Conrad's death. It is unclear if she will face criminal charges in this case. That resignation from the council happened just 4 days after Conrad died. Poppy's Playhouse is now closed. Its license has been suspended by the state of Missouri, according to KSDK out of St. Louis. As for Hedrick, she is now an accused murderer. She waived her arraignment and entered a plea of not guilty. Hey, before we get back to this episode of On the Case, one of the most watched shows on YouTube, I need to talk about our partner and sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. This is America's largest injury law firm. They have more than 1,000 attorneys and a history of winning. They've recovered more than $25 billion from more than 500,000 clients, and in just the past few months, a client in Florida received $12 million after the insurance company offered just $350,000. In Pennsylvania, a client was awarded $26 million. That was 40 times the insurer's $650,000 offer. And another client in Pennsylvania received $29 million after being offered only $500,000. Even if you don't think your case is worth millions of dollars, why not fight for what you deserve? Morgan & Morgan makes it so easy to file a claim. You can do it with just 8 easy clicks on your phone. So if you're injured and you need to start a claim, go to www.forthepeople.com/OTC. You can also scan this QR code on your screen or click the link below. And as far as that civil wrongful death lawsuit that we've been talking about throughout this story, Hedrick is still facing that lawsuit, but KSDK reports that her attorney withdrew from that case because she stopped communicating with them. Joining us now from Missouri is trial attorney Allie Young. Thank you for taking the time to be with us on Law and Crime. Very sad case that we're following here. The daycare worker, former daycare worker, is facing a second-degree murder charge. What will prosecutors have to prove in this case to get a conviction?
Yes, so thank you for having me. First off, absolutely just a heinous set of facts that we have here. On count 3, so she is charged with murder in the second degree, which is a class A felony, but it's actually charged under the subsection of felony murder. And so first off, the prosecutors have to prove that she committed a felony, and in the commission of that felony, that caused the death of the child that we're talking about here. And so they charged child abuse or neglect resulting in death as the underlying felony for first degree or for second degree murder. And so first they have to show that the daycare worker, Miss Hedrick, her actions caused the death of the child. And in doing so, then they can in turn prove murder in the second degree.
Because I know it varies from state to state. And in a lot of states where if you're doing something reckless and it causes someone's death, that might be a manslaughter charge. Is that similar to the charge we're seeing here, as opposed to, you think of like the first degree murder, something that was premeditated, that you were going to take someone's life and it happened? How does that vary? I mean, could this have been a manslaughter case in Missouri?
So yes, manslaughter, there's voluntary and involuntary in Missouri. This would be an involuntary manslaughter where somebody recklessly caused the death of another person. However, under felony murder, how it's charged with the underlying felony of abuse or neglect of a child, the mens rea, as we call it, is knowingly. So did she knowingly cause the child to suffer a physical injury? And as a result, the child died from that injury. And so the mens rea they have to prove in order to ultimately prove the murder in the second degree count is that she knowingly caused physical injury to the child. I'll use his initials, CA. And so if they can show that on count 1, she's guilty of knowingly causing a child to suffer physical injury and in result the child died, then they can in turn say, because of this underlying felony, she's guilty of murder too, the felony murder count.
It was a really tough indictment to read, the wrongful death lawsuit that the family filed. It gets to the point where it just is step after step, and it just gets more and more difficult to read. When you read that and you see it's I won't get into the specifics because at the time we're doing this interview, we kind of already went through it, where it seemed one step after another, trying to restrain the boy and then just leaving him until it was around 2 o'clock in the afternoon when it was time to leave. How strong of a case does it seem, based off that part of it, that prosecutors have?
I, from based off just what we're reading in the wrongful death lawsuit and the charging document and what we see in the news, it seems that the prosecutors have a very strong case. In this case, they're probably they used the grand jury in order to indict. So I imagine they did that in order to kind of bypass some procedural steps here. But I imagine they showed the grand jury medical records from a coroner's office showing what the coroner would cause or would say the cause of death was, the manner of death being homicide.
And this happened, he lost his life on May 16th of this year. And Tiffany Hedrick is arrested last week. I think it was August 14th, August 15th, that she was indicted by this grand jury. What do you make of how long it took for this arrest to be made?
You know, I don't put a whole lot of weight in the fact that it took several months for charges to come. I think this is a prosecuting office that took their time and made sure that they had the supporting documents that they needed before they rushed to a charge. They I would imagine they made sure that they had what they needed from the coroner. They had medical records and they had prior medical records before CA died to make sure that was the cause of death and that they got it right before they issued any sort of indictment.
And you have this wrongful death lawsuit that the victim's family brought forward back. It was within, I think, a week and a half of his death, this lawsuit suing not just Tiffany Hedrick, who was the daycare employee, but also the person who owned the daycare, who actually was a city councilor at the time, and she had resigned. How does the arrest impact how that case could play out?
Well, I think the arrest would, if I were looking at it as my client were also sued in the wrongful death case, I would then stop any sort of litigation or any sort of combating of the allegations made in the wrongful death lawsuit. Because once you start making statements and once you start saying under oath statements, then they can be used against you in your criminal court. And a criminal case to someone is always going to carry more severe repercussions than a civil case. So I imagine it kind of stalls the wrongful death lawsuit maybe a tad, but because the owner of the daycare and the daycare itself are not actually charged, that's kind of where they're going to be looking to get the money from anyways.
What goes in, and clearly there is no amount of money that could ever solve the pain that this family has and the loss that they went through. There's no conviction that could undo what has been done. But when it comes to determining how much money could be awarded in a wrongful death lawsuit, what would go into that in a case like this?
Sure. In Missouri, you can be awarded two types of damages in a wrongful death lawsuit, either economic damages or what we would call non-economic damages. Economic damages are basically funeral expenses, medical costs, things that are related to the death of that individual. Non-economic damages then cover more of the pain and suffering, the loss of companionship, things of that nature, emotional distress that maybe the family has gone through since losing their child. And there's no real cap on non-economic damages. So on the economic damages, you have to provide receipts, you have to provide documentation showing what it costs for a jury to be able to award that. With non-economic damages, it's really just determinative of what the jury hears as far as facts goes, and that's where you see the higher dollars being awarded to people that are involved in those wrongful death lawsuits.
And in that wrongful death lawsuit, as we've been talking about, you have the owner of the daycare, and she's accused in the wrongful death suit on the civil side of knowing of this technique, that they'll call it a technique, that was done on this young boy, allegedly, that ended up costing him his life, and that she didn't train her employees enough to know how to handle people who had specific medical needs like this victim had. She's not facing charges at the time of this recording. What goes into the decision from a prosecutor's office of looking at this and saying, okay, well, we know that this daycare worker, they believe, is responsible for the death of this boy, but why not charge someone else in connection if they at least knew that this technique was going to be done and that technique is something that caused murder?
There's a difference in alleging it in a wrongful death lawsuit and being something that prosecutors can also prove. So when prosecutors are looking to charge certain cases, they're looking ahead of time to see, can I prove this beyond a reasonable doubt? And those allegations that are made in the wrongful death lawsuit, there needs to be very minimal evidence or very minimal uh, just provided in order for them to say, yes, the daycare worker or the daycare owner is aware of this technique. And so that standard is much lower than what a prosecutor is going to want in order to start charging another person because of somebody else's actions.
And I know in a lot of people watching, when it comes to the civil side of it, the bar, that burden is not as high as it is in the criminal case where it's beyond a reasonable doubt. Inside, like, what specifically though is the difference? Like, for us to really understand those terms of, clearly you need to prove 110% that someone committed murder, but then what really is it in the civil courtroom for a wrongful death lawsuit to be awarded for the victim's family in this case?
Sure. And that is that's something that defense attorneys wrestle with on how to describe what is the difference between beyond a reasonable doubt and what is the difference between probable cause. But in the civil world, you're just looking for a preponderance of evidence. So if you're thinking of Lady Justice and her scales, do you have enough evidence to tip the scales just slightly in the favor of the other? That's a preponderance of the evidence. And then on the criminal side, you're looking for beyond a reasonable doubt. You don't have to have no doubt at all. But it just has to be beyond a reasonable doubt that any juror could have that somebody is guilty of the crime they committed.
Reading through the indictment, the wrongful death lawsuit, you just think of, here's the time to be a criminal defense attorney, that this is a really tough job because of a lot of outrage in the community, a lot of the evidence that's being accused, but the defendant in this case, the suspect, like, she is innocent until proven guilty. What are some of the strategies that you would expect to see from her defense in this case?
Sure. Expert witnesses. Expert witnesses can play a huge part in determining whether or not the cause of death was actually asphyxiation. If there is some expert out there that is able to say, no, that wasn't the cause of death and put some reasonable doubt in a juror's mind, then that's the route that you would go. But if there's not, then you're looking towards a different aspect of handling the case. And not every case has to go to trial, and not every case is meant to go to trial. And so maybe a case like this is you're looking towards mitigation and how you can maybe save your client's life in a different aspect as far as a reasonable sentence instead of just winning at trial.
Talking about saving a client's life, how does the penalty that she could face if she's found guilty, the punishment for this second-degree charge she's facing, how would that compare to a first-degree murder charge if she was found guilty of that?
They're the exact same, except for the fact that murder in the first degree, there are two options in Missouri: life with prison or life without the possibility of parole. So we call them an LWOP, so life without the possibility of probation or parole, or life with the possibility of probation or parole. That's murder in the first degree. Murder 2 is a 10 to 30-year sentence range, which they're both Class A felonies, but that is the range of punishment for murder 2. It's the same for the Class A felony of abuse or neglect of a child, which is charged with in count 1. They're both Class A felonies, 10 to 30, both 85% crimes, meaning they have to do 85% of the time that they are given before they're eligible for probation or parole. And then in count 2, you're charged with armed criminal action. That is an unclassified felony, which carries a minimum of 3 years in the Department of Corrections, where you have to do that day for day. There's no 85%er on that, but the minimum is 3 and the maximum is 15.
What timeline, now that this arrest has been made, she's been indicted by a grand jury, she has entered a not guilty plea, she's being held without bond, what happens next?
Sure. So they bypassed a significant portion of the procedural steps by charging her with an indictment by the grand jury instead of with just an information, meaning they've already had a probable cause finding to determine whether or not a felony was committed, and she was the one that committed that felony. So now that she's in circuit court by way of the grand jury, now the next reasonable step is just set the case for trial. As a defense attorney, you're not going to get a plea offer that you like, obviously, right off the bat here. And I imagine with the press that this case has received, there won't be a plea offer. And so the only other option is to set the case for trial and start working up the case from there.
And I always think now, in a very different case, I say that, but just because Idaho and Brian Koberger, all of that had been in the news, and that went on for 2 years of motion after motion, defense attorneys trying to exclude certain pieces of evidence, stretching this process out for a long period of time. In a case like this, why would, or what would your expectation be? Why is it that some cases end up having that 2-year period where an attorney can motion after motion after motion and drag it out, but then in other cases you're headed straight to a trial where you might not have the resources to be able to fund an attorney, maybe in the way like Hedrick does here?
Sure. The difference here is going to be I'm almost positive, just because I have a child in daycare, that they have all of this caught on video. And by reading the wrongful death lawsuit, it sounds like they've seen every action that Miss Hedrick took on video. And so that's going to be the difference in how long this case takes. And then whether or not they can find a expert to rebut the state's assertion of asphyxiation by the CA. And then it's just going to be up to the judge's calendar. They did obviously get a new venue for the case. They moved it out of St. Francis County into Jefferson County, just for the publicity of it. And so it's just going to be up to when the judge can find time in their calendar to try it. I imagine she'll be in custody for a period of time that will change her priority status on a judge's trial calendar. But the weight of the evidence is what's going to be determinative of how long this case takes.
And we'll see how it plays out. I mean, a big step forward for this family when it comes to the arrest, but we'll see whether or not the defendant in this case is found guilty. Allie Young, trial attorney from Missouri, thank you for joining us and helping us break this down on Law&Crime.
Thank you for having me.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law&Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.